Well, first of all, let me introduce myself. As I welcomed you on behalf of Existence, it's because I am one of the coordinators, and my job is to try and make complexity accessible to the general public, to business, to government, and so on. And since Existence is a European network of excellence, we have tried to have around Europe. And if there's anyone here who would like to host a seminar in future, do let me know at some point today. And at the end of the day, I will tell you a little bit more about the next one on art, complexity and technology that we will be holding in Turin in May. So that's one of my, as we say in English, I wear several hats, and being coordinator, one of the coordinators in Existence is one of them. You will in fact hear from one other coordinator later on, which is John Cassidy. I'm also the director of the Complexity Research Programme at the London School of Economics. I set up the research program in '95 when I realized that there wasn't enough work being There wasn't enough work being done in a social context. There was a tremendous amount being done at the time in the natural sciences, but not enough in a social context. And we have since then, thank you so much, done a lot of research working collaboratively with organizations. And what I would like to present in the next half hour is some of that work. And I would like to do two things. I would like to give you an exceedingly brief outline of a theory of complex evolving systems, and specifically complex social systems, and to give you just one example of some of the work that we have been doing recently, so that you can see of the theory, because a theory without an application in practice is really only half useful. So what are complex systems? I think that's a question that we'll all need to think about and discuss. And since I'm not sure how many of you actually have a deep background in complexity, that's why I want to give just a very brief outline. They are multidimensional and they're non-linear. Within a social context, we can talk about these systems being having social, cultural, technical, political, economic, and various other dimensions. Is how do they interrelate? How do they influence each other? A lot of the thinking that we are imbued with is that we take one aspect, such as the technical, and we focus on that to the exclusion of the others. What complexity points out is that we cannot really do that. We really do need to bring the different elements together to see the whole, and how they, not only how they interrelate, what the relationships are between them, but also how they co-evolve, how they influence each other and change each other's behavior. The other thing that I would like to introduce is some characteristics that these complex systems have, because we keep asking the question, what is a complex system? What is it that distinguishes it from systems that are non-complex or complicated? And what I would like to do is to show you some of those characteristics. The list that I will present you is not exhaustive, but these are some of the key characteristics that I think if a system does have them, then it's far more likely to be complex. But the key distinguishing feature is that a complex system can actually create new order. It has the capacity to create something new, something fresh. A complicated system, a machine-type system, an exceedingly complicated engine, for example, that capacity. It cannot create new order, and that is what would distinguish it from a complex, and I would suggest a complex evolving system is the term that I use, and I will explain in a moment why. The other point that I think we need to be aware of is that complexity shifts the emphasis from objects to relationships. It isn't so much, how a particular object or item is its own characteristics, but the relationships between them, and the relationships that we have with them. So these are some of the characteristics that we can look at that a complex system may have. Complex behavior arises from connectivity, and through that connectivity there is intricate interdependence. When, for example, you change something in one part of a system, and then that produces totally unexpected consequences in another part, this is very much due to the intricate interdependence that has arisen through interrelationships throughout the system. The other thing that we're very familiar with is emergence, emergent properties which are very often surprising, sometimes unexpected, and very often we cannot predict them by studying the initial elements. And of course, feedback. Now, why I have made a separation between those characteristics and the rest is because I'm very often asked, what is the difference between systems theory and complexity? And a very superficial answer is that with systems theory, these four characteristics we are very familiar with from systems theory. But systems theory does not actually articulate or deal with all the other characteristics, such as self-organization, coevolution, far from equilibrium, and so on. And I think these are some of this is part of the major contribution that I think complexity has made to our thinking, because understanding those characteristics is very important. And when we are looking at organizations, and I would suggest that every single human organization is complex, and if we understand what these characteristics mean, we can actually work with them. As I said, we work with a lot of organizations, large, small, in the private and in the public sector. What we find is that very good managers actually intuitively use these principles of complexity. But what they don't have is the language. It's a specific thinking. And what happens is they themselves, they describe what they're doing as groping in the dark, like a blind person in the dark. They think that using these ideas intuitively somehow is not quite adequate. The moment they realize that doing is in fact underpinned by quite a profound and rigorous theory, it gives them a great deal of power and confidence, and then it's like a light going on, and they can actually see that once they see their organizations as complex evolving systems, they can then work with those characteristics instead of inadvertently blocking them. And what I will describe when I talk about Rolls-Royce Marine is very much how those characteristics were blocked without intending to. So what do these things mean? First, one other distinction I would like to make is that we, and here I mean our group, because since this is a very new discipline, we do have a lot of views of what complexity is. So what I will say this morning is the view of the LSE complexity group. And we do not use complexity only as a metaphor or an analogy. We actually look at organizations as complex evolving systems in their own right. And we constantly ask what is relevant, what is appropriate. For the simple reason that if all you're using is an analogy or metaphor, you push a metaphor far enough and it breaks. You look at a system like an organization, as I said, in its own right as a complex evolving system, and then you try and understand its underlying characteristics. And again, just very, very briefly, in terms of human organizations, how can we see some of these characteristics in a human context? Human organizations, and I think you will understand that from your own experience, and that's the thing you constantly have to apply to. Does that make sense to me? Does it make sense in terms of the organization I'm part of? Can I see examples of self-organization? When you have a group of people spontaneously coming together because they need to do something, that is self-organization. However, if a manager were to say, you and you get together in order to do a job, that is not self-organization, because there's an external agency, someone external to the group has actually brought them together to do something. And in my terminology, that is much more self-management. And that is how the distinction is made, that a self-organized group is a group that decides by itself what to do, how to do it, when to do it, without external direction. Coevolution, and this is very, very interesting and important, is how there is not influence in one direction, so that we don't think that those who are more powerful, or usually we think of as the environment out there being the dominant element, and we change and adapt to the environment, because if there is reciprocal influence leading to change in both directions, that is co-evolution. And that is one of the reasons why I have shifted the name from complex adaptive systems to complex evolving. And in fact, to be quite accurate, it should be complex co-evolving systems, because it captures it much more accurately. Language is very, very important. When we talk about adaptation, the idea in our heads is adapting to something else, adapting to the environment. Now, I would like to suggest to you that this one-way process is very rarely the case. That is much more frequent, that there is a reciprocal influence leading to reciprocal change. And of course, we are exceedingly good at creating very intricate networks of relationships. It is those relationships that create complex behavior, and of course, they are sustained through communication and other forms of feedback. But the thing I would like to pick up here is the point that there are different degrees of connectivity and interdependence. Connectivity is not a singular relationship. My relationship with you is going to vary over time. Its density, its frequency, its quality, it's going to change. It is not going to be the same thing. And we tend to forget that there are degrees of connectivity and interdependence. And we're also exceedingly good at creating something new, and when it is emergent, when it is through interaction, it is also surprising and unexpected. The other thing we often tend to forget is history and culture. We are located within a context of our history and our culture. We cannot transcend them totally, because they do influence our actions. And when I hear of organizations when they say, we are going to create a new culture tomorrow and we're going to completely forget our history, I really find that exceedingly surprising and rather naive. We meet a constraint. We are able to explore a space of possibility. Just think of your own experience. When you have something in mind, when you have a goal and an aim, and suddenly you find that there are a lot of problems placed in your way, what do? You may give up, that's one option, but very often you will find different alternatives. You will explore different other ways of achieving your goal. You may, in fact, in the process, even change your goal, and very often you may find that the new way that you have created may even better than the old one. But the point here is complex systems are able to explore various alternatives before taking action. I hope that now you're beginning to get a sense of what a complex system might be like and why I prefer to use the terminology complex evolving system. If you want to read more about these 10 characteristics, there's a chapter in this book, and you can also find it on our website at the LSE. Okay, so what does the logic of complexity tells us? Is it shifts the emphasis from control. This is a major shift. It shifts it from control to what we call enabling environments. It says, don't try to design an organization top-down. Actually, if you provide the environment that facilitates things like self-organization, coevolution, exploration of the space of possibilities, you will actually get an organization which is much more robust, much more capable of co-evolving with the changing environment. And that is the absolutely key here. How do we create the capacity within our organizations? And I'm not talking here only about large organizations, because all these characteristics are scale invariant. They apply from everything to a small team to an entire country. So how can we actually create that capacity within every individual so that the whole can actually co-evolve with a changing environment instead of going through a very painful process and restructuring? I think these are some key ideas. And the idea is based on co-creation. These are some of the organizations we've worked with, we've tested the theory with, but now very, very briefly I'd like to give you one example. Rolls-Royce Marine, you are familiar with Rolls-Royce. They no longer make cars, but what they do is they make engines. They make engines for the aerospace industry, and they also make engines for submarines. So they work for the defense industry. Now they decided they wanted to expand into a brand new market, which is commercial marine. They wanted to make engines and in fact whole systems for commercial shipping, for ferries and so on. To do that, they actually acquired a set and these firms had already gone through a long series of mergers and acquisitions, and they were distributed throughout the Nordic countries. So they were here in Finland, in Norway, in Sweden. Now, the point is that 2 years after that acquisition, there seemed to still be a lot of problems. And the problem they thought they had was that the different national cultures were the issue. Everything that happened that they found difficult, they actually use that reason as an excuse. They did not look very much further. They therefore had a great deal of lack of integration, and as I said, the emphasize apparent there, because what I want to show you, that was not the real issue. They had a conference to find out what was actually happening. That's 2 years after the acquisition. And what the conference identified, there were two things that they needed to look at. One was to clarify roles and responsibilities, and the other one was that they really did need to increase cultural awareness. Now, their HR director at that point asked our group to help. But the other thing that he did, and that was quite a wonderful thing and surprising to us, and this is how things constantly change and co-evolve. He said, we have this team, this accelerated leadership development team. These are our high flyers, leaders of Rolls-Royce. Would you like to work with them? And of course we would. Absolutely wonderful. And we had 16 volunteers from the ALD group to actually work with us. And they made up 3 teams. The 4th was the team from the LSE. So suddenly we jumped from a couple of researchers to having practically 20 in total. And what did we do? Together, we trained those 16 how to do interviews, and we did 44 interviews throughout the Nordic countries, in the US and in the UK. And then we brought them together in a 2-day facilitated workshop. And what that did was we worked together, we co-created a set of recommendations that went to the board. And that sense of co-creation was very, very, very important. Now, we we used several tools in this particular thing. This is just a very brief summary. You do have a description of the different tools that we use, because one of the things I always wish to do, and we are constantly exploring, is to bring together qualitative and quantitative tools and methods. I think it's important to bring the two together because organizations have both characteristics. But the other thing is that organizations like Rolls-Royce, who are engineers, they actually want very, very robust findings. They want facts and figures. They don't want, just purely qualitative-based research. One of the things we did is this thing called LOM. This is the landscape of the mind. This is based on a psychological test which identifies preferences, the preferences of their managers. And what we found was that, in fact, 70 of the top managers took the test. It's done by email. And therefore, the data comes directly from those individuals that are involved in the decision-making process. Now, the interviews had already indicated the findings from the landscape of the mind, and what that showed was that there were no significant differences between the Nordic and the UK managers in terms of the preferences, in the way that they made decisions, in the way they learned. Now, that was quite an astounding finding. And because we had the two tools, a qualitative and a quantitative one, supporting each other, it was really beyond doubt here. And that's what started to make the difference. So what was it that was creating the problems? What was it that was still creating this lack of integration? These are some of the themes that we found. Okay. Some of the things that were issues, and it comes under this list. I cannot give you more details because they are confidential, but I'd like to pick out because they actually made a significant difference, although there were others, was that Rolls-Royce had imposed a matrix structure. Now think about it. The firms that they acquired in the Nordic countries were very small. They all knew each other, not just by name, but face to face. These small firms, to actually have to impose a very complicated matrix structure, simply was inappropriate. They were also given no means of how to, no support or to understand what it meant, how they can work within it. And what it did, it actually, they also imposed procedures which are necessary and essential in an aerospace context, but quite inappropriate in this commercial marine context. And one of the side effects were, for example, that let me just give you a comparison here. In aerospace, you're working a 20-year time horizon. In commercial marine, you've got a week. The difference is really quite significant. On Monday, your customer will ring and say, I want a modification to the product, can you do it? By Friday, you may be signing that contract. Now, if you have to go back to Derby every time you have to make that decision for authorization, you can see how that will delay the process. Now, these companies were acquired because they were the best in the world. They were the best because they were very, very flexible. They were very innovative. So what was happening? Without meaning to, Rolls-Royce were beginning to destroy the very characteristics they bought the organization, those firms for. Now, can you see, as I said, they did not understand what they were doing. The moment they started understanding what from a complexity perspective, that they were blocking self-organization, they were blocking therefore innovation, they were blocking their coevolution, etc., etc. It was quite a significant thing. Okay, now 3 main issues. So the lack of integration, the problem was lack of integration. Part of that was the fact that coevolution was not encouraged. What was happening is that each individual firm was simply going along the evolutionary path without relating to the others. Instead of creating a coherent whole that could build on its strength, they were pulling it apart and made it weaker. The other issue that they had was the effect on new product development. They actually blocked innovation and they blocked emergence and they reduced the exploration of the space of possibilities. These are just summaries, and please understand, the issues are much, much deeper and much more complex, but I simply wanted to give you a highlight of some of those issues. And then the imposition of the matrix structure. What they did was they assumed that a single culture was possible and desirable. Your own organizations. How often is it that we assume that such a thing is actually feasible? Any organization is made up of multiple interacting cultures. There is no organization that has one unique, universally applicable culture. So, RRM actually listened. They created 12 action streams to facilitate integration. They actually did make quite a difference. This is an overhead from the HR director himself, which is what he said. And we have a book that we have edited with Ali and others. It's at the back. You can order it, and it actually describes the methodology. Okay. So I would like to with a few thoughts of what a complex evolving organization would look like. This has been called the Holy Grail because it is not easy to achieve. But if it is, then I think we will get organizations which are very flexible, which are adaptable, which co-evolve with their environment. And you do have all that in your pack, so I don't want to actually go through them in detail because I would like to. We only have just a few minutes for a couple of questions, but please do note your questions because at the end of the day I would like to take all of them. So any questions, comments? Yes.
My name is and I work with environments and environmental psychology, and I try to do collaborative networking with different groups how to mobilize. Now, if we have a community like, for instance, this town where we are living now, which has a very sort of centralized organization, everything is against these wonderful concepts.
Yeah.
So is it completely impossible to? I mean, I am an idealist. I'm not going to give up my project, but still, when I see all those beautiful concepts and what you have succeeded in doing. So it's sometimes impossible to do.
It is an ideal, but it is not impossible. We have worked with organizations have achieved it. But it takes time. One organization, the Humberside Training and Enterprise Council, took 5 years to get to a point where they had a lot of these characteristics. It doesn't happen overnight, and it does mean that the whole organization has to work together. You cannot impose it from the top. You have to work collaboratively, and you have to actually want to change. You cannot impose that kind of change. And I think that's the key. How do you engage people? Because all of us have skills to contribute. And I think that is the point. Yes?
My name is Peter Sikuchak, I'm from Slovakia. I was very impressed with your thoughts. I was just hearing back about my organization coming from university. And I consider university as a very important part of the society because it has impact for young people and so on and so on. So I'd be very interesting to do such a case study at the universities. What are the results? I think all of us are more or less, a couple of people here are coming from the university. If this would help to improve the quality of the university, and especially in my society as a newcomer to EU, I think it's very important. My question would be, did you make some case study on the university also?
I wish I could. No, I haven't. But I would very much like to discuss it with you later, because I think you've pointed the finger there. Don't do it in our universities, then we are missing a very, very large opportunity, because our young people that are going to go out there tomorrow are the ones that are going to make these changes possible.